Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Why savings and your credit score really matters. But first, how about this? The ice cream trail, what's that all about? Hang in with us and we'll tell you.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, we're going to get to some very serious topics. We're going to talk about the minimum wage. We're going to talk about the Fetterman marijuana tour, recreational marijuana tour. John Fetterman, he's the lieutenant governor of the state, was on a 67-county tour. We're going to get to some pretty important policy questions that will be before the General Assembly. But first, joining me is Marc Levy. He's with the Associated Press, and Angela Couloumbis with the Philadelphia Inquirer. I got to ask you, the big story of the week, we now have 3, not 1, as we had ice cream trails. What's that all about?
That is a huge story, Terry.
But it's fun, no? I mean,
without question.
But it's all about helping a certain group in our economy, right?
Yeah, so last year the state started its first summer trail for creameries around Pennsylvania, and it was so successful that this year they decided to open 3 trails, and you can procure a passport, and as you visit these trails and actually eat ice cream, you can get a stamp and you'll be eligible for various prizes. It's very exciting.
Farm to Cone Creameries, I got that right?
That's right.
And you can get on Ice Cream Trail, the Ice Cream Trail website. I have no clue what that's about, but I thought we'd bring it up. All right, let's get to some pretty serious matters. Let's start with the minimum wage. Polls show minimum wage is very popular in the state. We have the $7.25, same as the federal government. It's been that way, if I'm right, since about 2006 or something like that. It's been there a long time. So let me ask you this question, and it's an important one. Will the legislature consider raising the minimum wage or not? Maybe not to the $12 that Governor Wolf would like to have this summer, going to $15, but is there a chance?
Yeah, so the question of whether the legislature will consider it, the answer is yes. And right now there are considerably serious talks going on between Republicans and the governor's office on that subject. The question is whether they can come to an agreement on something. It won't be 12, as you said, but every neighbor of Pennsylvania has raised its minimum wage, including Ohio, which is a state governed by Republicans. So what would the number be? Would there be exemptions for small businesses? Would there be exemptions for more rural areas? Would there be a much slower climb up to an increase? What are the various caveats there, and could Democrats go along with it?
Yeah, one of the problems that gets raised with it has to do with some people in the business community. It'll hurt small business. Number 2, will it affect a lot of people for which I should say it's a part-time job? But we do have Senator Corman, the majority leader in the Senate, who says, let's talk, let's negotiate. Am I correct about that?
Yes, and when he made that comment a few months ago, it made big news because up until now, really for the last decade, it hasn't been a topic of discussion, a serious topic of discussion during budget negotiations or any other time of the year, despite the fact that there has been every session various senators and representatives with bills proposing an increase.
So is something more, I put it this way, more likely to happen than not? Or I know, that's a crazy question asking.
Something is always less likely to happen in the legislature than to happen because of the various horse trading and give and take that has to happen. This is a relatively short time period for this to happen, and Republicans, if the Senate and House Republicans can agree on something that Democrats might be willing to go along with, the question is what will Republicans want in exchange, and would Democrats agree to it?
All right, well, let's turn to another subject, and that's John Fetterman and recreational marijuana. We're one of, I think, 23 states that have medical marijuana. 10 states have now legalized recreational marijuana. It's John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, you take it. What did he do?
Right. So he has spent the last 3 months going to each county in Pennsylvania to discuss and have a listening tour, and would invite the public to come and give its input. Generally speaking, what he has said since the end of his tour is that there is quite a bit of public support for legalizing recreational marijuana. However, the devil is always in the details. Even there are a couple of bills floating around in the legislature for it, for legalizing it. But as we've seen even in our neighboring states, where we have Democratic-controlled legislatures and Democratic governors, where there is a lot of support for legalizing it, those efforts have fallen apart in recent months.
All right, we're going to run to a quick break. We're going to continue with this discussion. Republican-controlled legislature, pretty conservative. I'm being descriptive about that, not pejorative. Likely to pass. I'm going to ask the gentleman sitting across from me the answer to that question in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, my guests are a couple of the state's leading journalists, Marc Levy with the Associated Press and Angela Couloumbis with the Philadelphia Inquirer. We're talking about the prospects for the legalization of marijuana, talking about recreational marijuana. Voters in the state in the Franklin and Marshall College poll, the Muhlenberg poll, all indicate majority support for it, and that has grown certainly over time. The legislature, again, conservative, Republican. My sense is it doesn't go anywhere.
Look, not even legislatures in liberal states have legalized marijuana, except for one state. Usually it has to go to a voter referendum, and we've discussed this before, that Pennsylvania has no direct ballot access. For voters. So it's a real long shot for Pennsylvania to legalize it in the near future.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, and having said that, I think there's going to be a lot of interest in this report that is going to be produced by John Fetterman. It is, he's working on it now. He's indicated it's going to be pretty exhaustive, and will look at some of the potential issues that were raised during the listening tour by the public.
Health issues.
Health issues, impacts on the state's current medical marijuana.
Driving.
Yes, all of these things are going to be, in theory, part of this report. So, and it sounds like it's going to be fairly exhaustive. Yeah. So I think that could change the conversation.
The information out there, John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, is a strong advocate for it.
Right.
Governor Wolf, on the other hand, has been more, I won't say indecisive, but he's taken a hands off and says, let's do, and I think I got his words correct, a serious and an honest look at it. And that's why he sent the lieutenant governor around the state doing these visits, some of which were highly attended, some not well attended. All right, Marc, let's go to something called Restore Pennsylvania. And why is this particularly important?
So the governor first proposed this in January, and he has spent the last 4 months pounding the pavement around the state, every media market making a pitch for it. It's essentially a $4.5 billion borrowing program for what he calls critical infrastructure and community projects, everything from improving flood control infrastructure to rural broadband to fighting blight in cities. and it would be paid for by a tax on Marcellus natural gas production. And so
something he's argued since he's been governor, correct?
This is his fifth straight year. I mean, he ran on it in both campaigns for governor. It's been rejected every year, particularly by the House Republicans. There was one year where the Senate Republicans passed a much smaller tax than the governor had been advocating, but it came with caveats and it died in the House. So it doesn't appear like this is going anywhere. There's no embrace of such a borrowing program by House or Senate Republican leadership, and the tax is a big problem.
So the point here, Angela, is it's not that many of the projects are not worthy, because we do have these badly needed. Some of it's infrastructure, flooding. I mean, we can go through the list of things. It's the question, given the state's fiscal situation, which is better than it was in the past couple of years, but we're talking about billions of dollars, correct? And you need a big revenue source.
Yes, and I think if you ask legislators, even on the Republican side, they will tell you that they like the concept of it, and in fact there is a group of Senate Republicans, Marc wrote about it this week, who have proposed an alternative funding source for a smaller project than what Wolf has actually proposed. So
you think a smaller project would have some?
Well, yes, if there was buy-in on the way that the Senate Republicans, or this group of particular Republican senators, is proposing, and what they're to now fund it, and what they're proposing is new leases to drill in state-owned forests,
but we
which
have
has
the
been
same
controversial.
You have the same problems you have a timing problem, because they're going to want to get out of Harrisburg in June. They don't want this budget to go, and though it's technically separate from the budget, you can't separate it, can you really, and when it's finally said and done?
You know, because of the horse trading involved, typically these things need to move in one big package. But yeah, I mean, we're at the beginning of June practically, and you know, these things have not really been hammered on quite enough to be close to finishing.
All right, we want to thank you both for coming in. All right, coming up, why saving and your credit score matters. We'll get to that in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Well, it's time for our consumer update, and joining me, as always is the case when we talk about your money and your saving, and the reason why long-term saving plans are important, is Patrick Conway. He's the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. And Donna LoStocco, she's the president and CEO of the First Commonwealth Federal Credit Union up in the Lehigh Valley. But we're glad you're here. Actually, we air up there. But let's get to the issue at hand. I learned this week, and I was stunned by this, that 1/3 of Americans, if they got a $400 emergency, a bill for some kind of medical services they got, would have to actually borrow. And here's another stunning: 25% of Americans skipped a medical procedure, a medical visit, I'll say, largely because they couldn't pay for it. I mean, you and I, we've chatted over the years about the need to save and why all that's important, but I was stunned by that. You get a bill, $400.
It is.
And you have to borrow the money. You have to go into debt for it.
It's really amazing, but that is a fact. And so many Americans just have not saved the way that they should. And part of what credit unions try to do is educate their members and consumers to have that rainy day fund for some sort of medical emergency. It's critically important.
Yeah, when you deal with folks who come in to see you, and you talk about their financial situation, how many of the folks who come in, you look at them and you say, you're not saving, and we can talk about the credit score, and you're going to...
Unfortunately, too many.
Is that a common or an uncommon problem?
Fairly common.
Wow.
I'll say, I don't know, 20-30% of the members we deal with, especially in the Lehigh Valley, which is still hurting from Bethlehem Steel going away,
right,
and that type of thing. So it's absolutely fairly common.
Yeah. And I don't see much likely to change. I mean, in some cases, you heard us talk about the minimum wage. You don't need to get involved in whether we should raise it or not. That's not something I want to ask you. But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of Americans who just simply are struggling day to day. And you see that's something else. Do you also see that?
Absolutely. And the fact that they haven't started to save even small amounts regularly can make a big difference over time, but people feel so overwhelmed by that. The idea of how can I save when I can barely pay my bills.
And the other problem is the increasing pressure because of student loans and student debt, and the fact that people, a student can spend years, as someone who spent his whole life on a college campus, years trying to pay back these student debts, and now we get into saving and debt, and we'll get the credit scores in a minute, whether they can have enough of financial security to be able to get a loan or take
right.
it.
And a lot of students coming out of college, because of the skyrocketing cost of tuition, have to borrow heavily to get through, and families are coming out with a lot of debt. So these young professionals coming into the workforce have that serious debt load even before they begin their first job, and it does take, in many cases, 10, 15 or more years to overcome from that debt.
And that's assuming they get a job right away.
That's assuming they get a job.
Great point, yes.
Yep. I'll tell you, we have about a minute left in this segment, but let's go to a break. We'll save the time because I want to get into the credit report and why that's important. We'll see you in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
All right, we're going to chat about a credit report. What is it? Why does it matter? This is important. It's not something that I fully understand, but there is no doubt about it that a credit report is critical to your financial stability in so many different ways, right or wrong.
It really is. In this day and age, a credit report is important to securing a good position, to perhaps renting, housing or an apartment. It's really a compilation of one's behavior and history when it comes to borrowing money and paying it back on time. And if you have a good credit report and a good credit rating, generally the cost of borrowing money is going to be less than if you have a poor one. But it's just so important in so many aspects.
You just made a pretty important comment. Given the nature of your credit score, you can actually save money when you borrow.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. The lower your credit score, the more you're going to pay when you need a loan.
Now, do you have to deal with that a lot with folks who come in and
all the time. All the time. I sat in our contact center the other day and listened to member calls. And I want to say out of the 15 calls that I listened to, there were 3 members who had tried to get a loan, couldn't because their scores were in the 500s. And, they have very little choice, but they think they have very little choice. In reality, they do have a choice. It's just going to take time. Right. And so there's a syndrome. They have an issue. They get into debt. They feel like there's no way out. And then they have a decision to make. They can either ask for help. And if they ask for help, get on the road to, and it involves a budget, and it takes time, but you can find financial freedom at the end of it.
Well, while we're talking about a credit report, what's a credit score?
Well, generally it ranges from 300 to 850. Anything over 700 is generally considered a good credit score. Anything below is not so good. And again, I think, depending on your credit rating, you can access funds if you need to borrow money at a lower rate, the better your credit score. So it is important. A lot of employers will check your credit score
before
when
they
you're
hire
applying
you
for a position.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it can give a glimpse or a snapshot into how somebody handles their financial affairs.
And about how responsible you might be.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the other aspect of this is if you have low credit, it's going to affect so much of your life. How much would you say, I mean, when you talk about you want to borrow to do A, B, or C, how important is that just in the daily lives of people?
Well, anything they want to do that's going to involve credit will affect them. So if their score is 700 or more, they're considered prime.
Yeah.
They basically will be able to do what they want in terms of getting credit, and their price of that credit will be low.
Yeah.
The reverse is true if it's 600 or under.
Yeah. So there's another option you have. If your credit score is low, there are things you can do to improve it, but I take it from what you just said, Donna, that it's not going to occur overnight. But what?
Right, it will take time, but if your credit score is low and you want to improve it, we encourage members and consumers to access credit, but pay it off on time.
Right.
So borrow small amounts, pay it off on time, and establish a long track record of paying that debt. Yes,
that's absolutely great advice. So people are going to want to know now, well, I may not even know anything about this credit score. Can I get online? Can I check it? How do you do that? You probably deal with that every day of your life, too.
Absolutely. You are entitled to a free copy of your credit report once a year. Mm-hmm. Your credit union can actually help you find it, but it's at freecreditreport.com.
Freecreditreport.com. Freecreditreport.com. Write that down. Go ahead.
And check it. And check it fairly frequently, because you're not only looking for errors, which, by the way, there are errors in credit reports, so it's up to you to watch it, but there also could be fraud. So you really have a dual purpose to watch for. Watch out for it.
And you can actually get help. I notice in some of the material that you put out, there are companies that you can go to that will actually help. But don't you have to be careful? I'm sure you get, I mean, the robocalls that I get right now are unbelievable, and I look at them and don't even bother to pick up the phone. Go ahead.
You do have to be careful. There's a lot of sources of help out there, beginning with your trusted financial partner, your credit union or community bank. But you do have to be careful in this day and age because of all the fraudsters out there. So find a trusted source, someone, an institution that you know well. Sure. Start with your credit union or your community bank partner and go from there. And that's a big part of what credit unions do.
Absolutely.
So, but the point I want to make here is for everybody, if you have a bad credit score, you can improve it. And ultimately, over time, the interest rate that you would pay to borrow money will go down, correct?
That's exactly right. And I think as Americans, we're impatient. And so what you do is you have to employ patience, and you start to pay off things very slowly. Once you pay off your car, for example, that monthly car payment amount you can now put toward other debt. And before you know it, you will chip away and become debt-free, hopefully.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you. I think this is an important update, not only on the savings part, but also on the credit score, and it's something that I think all of us need to be more familiar with. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.